Hello and welcome. This is the second in a series of 3 programs on HR value and business impact. In each of these programs, we're sharing some research findings, methods, and tools you can use in your organization, and we'll share a case example from an HR leader who's lived through it. My name is Jerry Seibert, and I'm with Metris Group, and my guest today is going to be Stephen Battalia, a former CHRO with Total Wine and with Nestle. And our focus today will be on outsourcing, how it can enhance or detract from the value that human resources delivers to the company. First, just a quick minute about Metris Group. For 30 years, we have served as a trusted advisor to business. We're researchers and practitioners, and we're strong believers in sharing knowledge with many articles and books published and available through Metris Institute and through our website, including our 2 most recent, Hidden Drivers of Success, which dives deep into how you can leverage employee insights for strategic advantage, and Fulfilled, Critical Life Choices, which offers tools to help you on your personal journey, as well as approaches that can help your employees become more mindful, more resilient, and more engaged in a world that threatens stress and burnout all around us. We work with clients from smaller nonprofits to some of the largest corporations in the world to assess challenges, deliver insights through analytics, and partner on interventions that impact business results, from executive team alignment to leader and team development to strategy and scorecard refinement. We're going to be talking a lot today about internal value, and value, of course, is quality over cost. Of course, in an internal relationship between functions like HR and all of your stakeholders in the organization, we're really talking about the quality of the relationship as well as the services you provide over the use of resources involved in maintaining that relationship. And for your stakeholders, that could be money if you've got a chargeback situation like some shared services environments, but can also just be the effort, the time, the energy, the hassle factor associated with working with the service provider, human resources, or any other function, IT, finance, what have you. And it's important to always remember that your view and your stakeholders' view may not be 100% aligned in terms of what is driving value. We've done a lot of research in this space, worked with a lot of HR functions, and have found that sometimes what is most impacting a stakeholder's perception of the value being delivered is a real eye-opener for the HR department. But one thing I can tell you for sure is that departments that focus on accelerating the internal value that they're delivering have a huge impact on their stakeholders. In fact, compared to departments that are not focused on delivering the highest levels of value, they're 6 times more likely to have helped their stakeholders achieve cost savings or better service, and 4 times more likely to have helped their stakeholders achieve better quality or increased productivity. One of the techniques, one of the strategies that has frequently been used to deliver greater value is outsourcing, because it is often viewed as a way to deliver the same or better service at a lower cost. And it is extremely widespread. In one of our studies that involved almost 2,000 companies, virtually all of them were outsourcing at least one function. And there was no function that was immune from this. Just about any corporate level function you could think of was being outsourced by some of these companies. Usually a partial outsourcing, taking some more transactional level activities, but sometimes very extensively, to the point where it was completely or virtually completely outsourced. What was interesting in that study was when we asked those companies whether or not they were meeting their goals for those outsourcing projects, how many of them were not. When it came to their financial goals, only 56% said that they had met or mostly met their goals. And for productivity targets, only 47% had achieved or mostly achieved their goals. When we look beyond that, it gets even worse. Service targets, 39%. Quality targets, only 37%. So there's a lot of room for improvement still in leveraging outsourcing as a value enhancement tool. We also asked those companies to describe what their typical relationship with their suppliers of outsourced services was. And almost half said it's a pretty good relationship, that we're teammates, we're working together, we win together, so it's pretty positive. Although another 17% said it was a positive relationship, but required a lot of oversight, almost closer to a parent-child relationship. And that was about 2/3 of the companies. Beyond that, the descriptions were a little more colorful and not as positive. Number of folks said, it seems like it's always one side looking for an advantage. We've got to be on our toes all the time, almost a predator-prey type of relationship. And for a few, their feelings were, it's not working out. We're stuck in this contract for now, but as soon as we can, we're going to be working our way out of this relationship. We've also taken a hard look at how outsourcing affects stakeholders. That is, what's their perspective on how service levels change when this relationship changes. And what we found is that as functions are more fully outsourced, internal service levels tend to decline. For functions that are not outsourced at all, on average, we find that they get about a 62% favorable rating. That'd be a rating of good or very good on the value they're delivering to their stakeholders. About 30% acceptable, and a small 8% being rated as poor or very poor. But for those functions that are partially outsourced, they only get about 49% favorable ratings and a lot more in the acceptable category. And in those cases where the function has been completely outsourced, that's where we see the unfavorables, people saying they're getting poor or very poor value from the relationship, pretty much doubling to where we have 1 in 5 stakeholders feeling that way. So not a positive outcome with the total outsourcing model. Now, that's not true for every function. In fact, we looked at which functions were most and least successfully outsourced. Legal, for example, it really didn't make any difference. Whether it was completely internal, partially outsourced, or fully outsourced, the ratings were pretty much the same from their stakeholders. The least successfully outsourced function was procurement. There, the ratings actually inversed. They went from almost 60% favorable down to about 25% favorable. And the unfavorable ratings actually exceeded the favorable ratings by the time we got to the fully outsourced model. Now, where does human resources fall between these two extremes? Well, human resources in many ways has a very unique role. You're the business partner, but you're also the compliance officer. It can be tough. So probably not too surprising to find that the pattern for human resources is actually closer to what we saw for procurement than what we saw for legal. Not quite as extreme, but still a case where in those rare instances where the function was fully or essentially fully outsourced, the unfavorable ratings actually exceed the favorable ratings. How often do supplier failures lead to insourcing a function that had previously been outsourced? I think this is an important question when you consider the resources invested in preparing to outsource, selecting a supplier, and managing the transition. And more than 1/3 of the respondents in our study said their organization had reversed course on at least one outsourced function, a fairly significant failure rate. The implications from a cost and lost productivity perspective are really pretty big. Participants in our study were asked to explain what were the reasons for bringing a function back in-house. And the most common themes focused on having more control of service levels, of quality and cost. And many of them said that the costs were not what they had expected. In some cases, there were surprises from the suppliers. And that, I think, is a failure of contracting. But then there were also internal costs that arose that simply had not been anticipated. That's not to say that bumps in the road mean you have to reverse direction completely. I was working with a Fortune 100 client. We did a global survey of managers to get feedback for HR as part of an internal value acceleration project. And one area where they got a lot of negative feedback was talent acquisition. Now, talent acquisition had recently been outsourced, but the CHRO was surprised and a little baffled by the feedback. All of their metrics, he said, like time to fill and number of open positions, were tracking the same or better than before. Well, when we dug into it, managers were not unhappy with time to fill and the like. They were finding that the external recruiters had much less expertise in recruiting the type of engineering talent that they needed compared to the old in-house staff. And it fell on them, the managers, to be much more involved in the process. And on top of that, the vendor had their own retention issue. So every time a manager felt they had a recruiter up to speed, they got a new one and had to do it all over again. Now, those were real unexpected costs, but they didn't show up on any HR metric, and certainly not in their budget. Now, to give them credit, they stuck with their supplier and worked through the issues. And as we tracked stakeholder satisfaction over several years, the ratings trended up for talent acquisition, and it became pretty much a non-issue over time. So all in all, how is outsourcing as a value acceleration strategy? Well, I think through that narrow lens of financial cost savings, it may in fact be more likely to succeed than fail. But from a broader perspective of quality, service, and productivity, the risk, I think, is a little bit higher. There has to be some really strong project management skills in place to ensure there's no drop off in those areas. And you have to be prepared that in the view of stakeholders, the value delivered is likely to decrease, at least the perceived value. And that's something that you would have to manage very closely to understand where their priorities are and make sure that you're delivering what they really want. So that's a little bit of background, a little bit of research that we've done in this space. And I'm going to bring my colleague, Stephen Battalia, into the conversation now. Stephen is going to share a case study that involved some outsourcing and some interesting approach to a shared services model. Stephen, welcome.
Hey, Jerry, how are you? Thanks for having me today. Appreciate it.
That's great. Stephen, could you start by giving us a little general background? Now, I understand this company deployed a shared services model that had an outsourced component, but can you tell us a bit about what they initially deployed and why?
Sure, and I think there's actually two outsourced components within the company, and I think it's a great model that listeners may be able to relate to on a couple of levels. So let me set the scene. You have a industrial company, about $10 billion, 10,000 employees, 15,000 employees or so, and a little bit late to the Ulrich model. And about 3 or 4 years ago, they went in what I would call a very classical bringing together of putting in the three boxes, and they completely centralized all functions. They set up the appropriate, all the things that everybody would know about, from recruitment to L&D. They put in business partners. They have 3 divisions, 3 large distinctive divisions. It's important. We'll talk about that later. They created the corporate function, of course, put a business partner against that. They set up a leadership group called the HRLT. And then the 2 components, they decided at this moment, they hired for the first time a head of talent acquisition, made that person a vice president on a leadership level. They brought everything in-house, but they outsourced 2 things at that moment. They were a PeopleSoft shop, and they decided that they'd like to have a focus area on recruitment, so they brought in Connexa, IBM, and in the sense they outsourced their ATS to Connexa. And secondly, the company had set up, which everybody knows in a southern city, a classic shared services center that was supporting finance, procurement, IT, and HR. And interestingly, again, we'll come back to it, that unit was headed up by a general manager who did not report into HR. And very importantly, the IT, Connexa, since it was a bolt-on piece, was not again run by HR. So that's the setup that we had. They had about 50 recruiters. They brought them all inside, and that was the scene that was set about 3 or 4 years ago.
Okay. So how did their key stakeholders view the end result of this approach?
So, Jerry, for about the first 18 months or so, I would say that things were going along. There was a little bit of the frog in the hot water, but generally it was working. There was a lot of commitment to this model. They wanted to save money, and definitely the overall HR budgets came down. They were getting set up with the business partner model. They focused a lot on getting the business partners ready, and during this time, the talent acquisition function, which as we continue to talk about, kind of basically got themselves set up, and they were working on putting in what should Connexa be configured with. And like one hint I'll give, precursor, they started to set it up in a very centralized way, which Connexa is built for, a very structured approach. But we'll see later that came to haunt them, and basically getting everything in place. And things were okay, but there were starting to be some red flags in terms of speed, accuracy, and the overall recruiting apparatus was showing signs of strain. And that's what was kind of happening in the first 18 months. Fairly classical for the shared service. And most of the other pieces were fine, but there were rumblings that quote unquote recruitment wasn't doing as well, and the divisions quote unquote were not happy, and that's kind of the situation that they were there.
Okay. What was HR's response if they were getting a bit of pushback or hearing rumblings?
Yeah, so before we kind of get into where they fell to, HR attacked it in a fairly classical, and it's interesting, just as a sideline, I actually, during this project, began to realize that because people leaving, and as I investigated, in a sense I became an internal investigator for this project, they had lost a sense of this history, and one of the charts that I put together giving the history over a 2-year, basically this declined into really a failed model. They didn't have a sense of the history. They missed some of the key points. So at this point, HR is saying, we got to work harder on making Connexa work and do the right things. What's the shared services doing? And they and a little bit started to get the let's work on understanding the division, all the classical stuff. I want to do it better, but they basically had a aha about 18 months later, and the model started really falling apart. And I can get into that. So, and actually, let me dive into that, and then before the next question, let me set the scene. So, what happened was that the patchwork failed, and the divisions, very much from the line, from the leaders, right from the top of the 3 divisions, said, this is not working. We support your shared services. We support your 3-box model, but recruitment has got to go back to the divisions. And I think this is the moment for a head of HR, for HR leadership team. What should you do? Should you go back to a decentralized model? Should you take out a piece after you spent all this time putting it together? Of course, there became a crisis with the head of talent acquisition. What was she going to do? And the whole team. And they decided, and it was quite a fight back and forth, and I would say that there was a bit of, interesting, my opinion, a failure of leadership and maybe some courage. And they said, you know what, the divisions are speaking. This is the operations. We're going to go and decentralize, and what they called it, we're going to come up with a federated model. And basically, they took it apart, and they put recruiters back into all the divisions. They appointed a head of talent acquisition in each division. The back office obviously stayed the same, but we'll talk about that a little later, what happened. And then they created a talent acquisition council to kind of arbitrage, so there was a second group from the leadership operations of HR. And then they appointed a part-time, because obviously the head of TA was fired. So they appointed a person who was head of compliance and a couple of other administrative areas of HR, and said that that person could be head of TA. And that's what they felt, Jerry, then this is where the kind of I come in. This is, everyone's unhappy.
So, I mean, that sounds like a very hybrid approach. It is still, a pure shared services model for some functions, but then this federated one for talent acquisition. How successful was that?
Yeah, and it wasn't. And let me do two things and then talk about what, because they felt like it could work. And I think this is the challenge for everyone on the call. It was a very logical response. I actually hadn't heard of this word federated before, but it makes perfect sense. A federated model. We have to take one component of HR out. We have to set up a way to run it. But implicit in that, and particularly with two outsourced components, the technology and the service idea. By the way, the service center, in essence, took the candidate from after they had been given the offer. It was their job to then put them first day in the job. All the critical finishing components, offer letter, reference checking, background checking, making sure everything, the desk is ready, et cetera, et cetera. And this really fell apart. And then the last component they had is a big acceleration of hiring, a tougher job market, and things really began to spin out as they were putting in, Jerry, logical components. So they tried. It's a federation. They have a council, but things continue to deteriorate.
Was budgeting an issue? I mean, it sounds like somebody would have to be deciding, well, this is really more associated with the back office stuff that's still being done in the shared services group, but this should really be with the recruiters and the divisions where there are fights over that. I mean, was that a struggle?
Yeah, this is a great point, and really this is one of the essence of my recommendations. So in that logical federation, the money fell apart. The shared services run by a general manager who was being asked to cut costs, and literally there were less service center people supporting HR than there were when they got started. Then, of course, there was happiness out in the divisions. The recruiters went from 50 to 80 because they're in the division, so they were getting all the recruiters that they wanted. But that was all happening haphazardly. And then lastly, HR in the middle, the leadership group. Well, what started to happen? We need some money to change our social media presence. We need to work on our employee value proposition. We need, in this case, they wanted diversity in their engineering and their technical communities. And they didn't have, and the person in the middle, I have no money. So very interesting in what seemed like maybe a nice moment, the divisions, I'm hiring more recruiters. If you looked at talent acquisition as a whole, they didn't have the right money in the right places. It was a huge problem, Jerry.
So what was the path forward from there?
So very interesting. So as the key and the thing to think about as things are falling apart, I just wanted to highlight for the listeners the ATS Connexa. Interesting, built for a centralized one way of doing it. They found lots of problems when you needed to support various divisions. And what was the classic thing? The recruiters were doing all things on their own. That's what a federation does. And while it seems okay and the divisions seem to be fairly similar, boy, there was a lot of differentiation. The next thing that really fell apart is they could not support, since they didn't have the money, they couldn't keep up with the robustness of Connexa, and they couldn't keep up with having a great candidate experience from the back office. And they were starting to literally get the complaints, the calls in, and you started to have that terrible moment where everyone is complaining, throwing out things. And interesting, the head of the shared services center said, hey, we're fine. We're processing the numbers of people. We're getting letters out, but they weren't able to give the time and the hand-holding to the candidates. And hey, that had really changed, and so the people aren't happy there. So what came out is, as this continues to roll in, I came in, and a number of recommendations and a number of things that they have ongoing. One is, well, we've got to move. We made a big error with Connexa, and we need to pull back, and we need to bring that back into PeopleSoft. Or if we move to a new PeopleSoft, which they're thinking about, you've got to buy an HCM package with it all included. That was one. Secondly, the HR leadership team needs to step up, and there were many voices. The HR VPs, different people from the technical community. Everyone was talking about talent acquisition, but it didn't have the one voice, and that team needed to, how do we communicate to the service center? And in fact, at the end of the day, they actually had to come up with their own funding to make sure that group, and they had to add 5 people in the service center. That's how kind of out of sync it got. The other thing that they had is again, it's a wonderful idea, good people, smart people. The Talent Acquisition Council, it was federated, so it was a council of equals, and everybody had a voice, but they could not focus. They could not get to various projects such as, what's our social media, what's our employee value proposition, how are we, they were, at the time we were looking at this, GE came up with, people have seen it on TV, 20,000 female engineers by 2020. And I was at a meeting where, well, we need to do that, but how do we do that? Not all the divisions agree with that. So that was a very interesting point that they got to, of started, and this is the ticks that they started to move to, of what are we going to do to figure this out.
All right. Well, Stephen,
so I think,
go ahead.
Just to I know we have to close. One thing I wanted to give just 2 insights of where this really went to is interesting. Some of the listeners may be going, aha, they brought it back to centralization. They did not. The pressure point of the divisions having their own recruiters and being close, which is so real in HR, continued, and they decided to stay with the recruiter and the divisions, but what they really needed is to focus on the whole. They needed to get their software and their service, and remember that HR still is one piece. Even when you outsource, it's one view to the customer, and that's where they focused all on the back, and then a little bit of focus on, they disbanded the TA council, and they got to a recruiter council that was all around the recruiters being better recruiters. So they put it together, but they still needed to have that divisional touch because that's what the business wanted. So I just wanted to point that out, Jerry.
Okay. Well, interesting that in the end they did still, keep their eye on what would be most satisfactory for the stakeholders, and in effect really refined their approach. Sounds like it took a while for them to get there, but
and I think that's a great point, Jerry, that it took a while. And really interesting, when I came in and in my interviewing, and this project lasted about 4 months, they just did not have the signals. And I think it's a great thing for an HR leader or senior team to think about. The signals were not getting all put together until I came in and just interviewed 30 people and listened and put it together, how they had to address this differently. And interesting, like you say, failure. They had to bring back in the technology, and if you're going to outsource to a function, basically insourcing, outsourcing, you've got to actively manage it. It's just not magic. Exactly to the points on your slide.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Stephen. I want to wrap up now and just remind everyone that we have one more webinar in this series, February 8th, same time. Our guest will be Alan Weisberg, former CHRO at Ethicon and longtime Chief Learning Officer at Johnson & Johnson. And we're going to talk about the business impact of onboarding, leader development, and succession planning, and with a little special attention to what to do when that executive hire you spent so long finding is struggling once they're on board. So thank you, everyone. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, everyone, for listening.
Yep. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any follow-up questions. Our emails are on the screen now, and we'd love to hear from you. Thanks.